Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that sounds innocent enough, a plant that made your nose run a little less and helped you breathe easier. But this isn't a story about herbal tea and gentle remedies. This is the story of how a humble shrub with medicinal roots became the chemical backbone of one of the most destructive drugs in modern history, methamphetamine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your curiosity shapes what we explore together, and I'm grateful for it. If you're enjoying these deep dives into history's stranger corners, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. And hey, we're now live on Spotify too, so if you'd rather listen while you drift off, check the link in the description. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. Somewhere in the mountains of ancient China, a healer plucks a scraggly green plant from rocky soil. It's bitter, it's tough, and it's been used for thousands of years to treat wheezing, congestion, and fatigue. Fast forward a few millennia, and that same plant, ephedra, has been synthesized, militarized, criminalized, and turned into the chemical foundation of a drug that would ravage communities, fuel cartels, and spark a global crisis. How does a diet pill plant become methamphetamine? How did traditional medicine morph into Breaking Bad? What happens when chemistry, war, capitalism, and desperation collide? And could you have seen it coming, or would you have been one of the millions who thought, it's just a little boost, what's the harm? Congratulations, you've just stepped into the strange, tragic, and wildly unexpected history of ephedra, the plant that accidentally fueled a drug empire. Let's begin. For over 5,000 years, Chinese healers reached for a scraggly, drought-resistant shrub called ma huang, ephedra. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't bloom with bright flowers or smell like paradise. But when someone wheezed through the night, coughed until their ribs ached, or dragged through the day with crushing fatigue, ma huang was the answer. Boiled into bitter teas, ground into powders, or mixed with honey, this plant opened airways, stimulated the heart, and brought energy back to exhausted bodies. It was medicine born from observation, refined over centuries and trusted across dynasties. But buried inside those tough green stems was a chemical compound called ephedrine, a molecule that would, thousands of years later, change the world in ways no ancient healer could have imagined. Let's talk about where ephedra grows. This isn't a delicate orchid demanding perfect conditions and pampering. Ephedra thrives in places that would kill most plants. Arid deserts, rocky mountain slopes, windswept plateaus, where the soil is more dust than dirt. It's a survivor clinging to life in Central Asia, Mongolia, northern China, and parts of the Middle East. The plant itself looks almost skeletal. Thin, jointed green stems reaching upward like fingers, with barely any leaves to speak of. It's the botanical equivalent of that wiry old man who never gets sick and refuses to die. Ancient Chinese physicians didn't just stumble upon ephedra by accident. They observed, they tested, they documented. The Sheneng Benqiao Jing, one of the oldest Chinese pharmacopoeias dating back to around the 1st century, lists ma huang as a superior herb. It was prescribed for what they called wind-cold conditions, basically respiratory issues, fevers, and body aches. If you had asthma, bronchitis, or just a nasty cold that wouldn't quit, ma huang was your friend. Boil the stems, drink the bitter tea, and within an hour your chest would loosen, your breathing would ease, and you'd feel a subtle surge of energy. Not euphoria, not a high, just relief. But here's the thing. Ephedra didn't just treat symptoms, it worked. And it worked because of chemistry that ancient healers couldn't see, but absolutely understood through trial and error. They knew the right dosage, too little, and nothing happened. Too much, and patients became jittery, anxious, their hearts racing uncomfortably. They knew to pair it with other herbs to balance its stimulating effects. They knew pregnant women shouldn't take it. They knew people with heart conditions needed to be careful. All of this learned over centuries without microscopes, without labs, without peer-reviewed journals. Just observation, tradition, and thousands of patients. Ephedra wasn't used casually. In traditional Chinese medicine, herbs were categorized by their intensity and risk. Mahuang was considered powerful, even slightly dangerous if misused. It was reserved for specific conditions, prescribed by trained practitioners, and administered with respect. It wasn't something you chewed on for fun or brewed up every morning like coffee. It was medicine, serious medicine, and it was treated that way. Fast forward to the 20th century, and suddenly this ancient remedy caught the attention of scientists in white coats who wanted to know exactly why it worked. They isolated the active compounds, ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, and realized they'd found something extraordinary. These alkaloids mimic the body's own adrenaline, triggering the same fight-or-flight response but in a controlled oral dose. For asthmatics struggling to breathe, this was revolutionary. For athletes looking for an edge, this was tempting. For pharmaceutical companies, this was profitable. But in their excitement to extract, synthesize, and commercialize ephedrine, Western scientists lost something the ancient Chinese had always known: context. Ephedra in its natural form, brewed as tea and taken under guidance, was relatively safe. Isolated ephedrine, concentrated into pills and taken without limits, was something else entirely. The plant had been tamed by tradition. The chemical would run wild, and the journey from Mahuang to methamphetamine had just begun, though no one saw it coming. Somewhere in a dusty Chinese apothecary, a withered stem of ephedra still sits in a jar, labelled in fading characters. It's been there for generations, and it has no idea what its chemical descendants would become. Ephedra worked because of what lived inside it: alkaloids, specifically ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. These weren't magical, they were molecular. Ephedrine mimicked adrenaline, the body's natural fight-or-flight hormone. It tightened blood vessels, opened bronchial passages, and sped up the heart. For someone struggling to breathe, it was a lifeline. For someone exhausted, it was a jolt of clarity. But here's the thing about chemistry: the same molecule that saves you can also push you past your limits. Ephedrine didn't just relieve symptoms. It revved the engine, sometimes too hard, and once Western scientists isolated it in the lab, they realized they'd found something powerful, a compound that could be purified, concentrated, and eventually weaponized. So what exactly is ephedrine doing inside your body? Let's break it down without turning this into a chemistry lecture that puts you to sleep. Ironic, considering we're talking about stimulants. Ephedrine is what's called a sympathomimetic, meaning it mimics the sympathetic nervous system, the part of your body responsible for the fight-or-flight response. When you're scared or stressed, your body releases adrenaline, your heart pounds, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and blood rushes to your muscles. Ephedrine triggers a similar response, just less intensely and for a longer duration. Here's where it gets interesting. Ephedrine works by stimulating alpha and beta adrenergic receptors in your body. Translation: it tells your blood vessels to constrict, which raises blood pressure. It tells your heart to beat faster and harder. And crucially, it tells the smooth muscles around your bronchial tubes to relax, which is why it was so effective for asthma. If you've ever struggled to breathe, really struggled, where every inhale feels like sucking air through a straw, you understand why ephedrine felt like a miracle. But ephedrine doesn't stop at your lungs. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, meaning it enters your central nervous system and messes with your head in subtle but significant ways. It increases alertness, reduces fatigue, and suppresses appetite. That's why, even in ancient times, some people noticed that mahuang tea made them less hungry and more focused. The ancient Chinese didn't have the vocabulary to explain it, but they recognized the effect. And once modern scientists understood the mechanism, they saw opportunity everywhere. Let's compare ephedrine to caffeine for a second, since everyone knows what caffeine feels like. Caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, which prevents you from feeling tired. It's like putting a piece of tape over the low battery warning light in your brain. Ephedrine, on the other hand, actually dumps more fuel into the system. It doesn't just hide fatigue, it actively stimulates your body to produce energy and alertness. The result? Ephedrine feels stronger, sharper, and more physical than caffeine. Your heart rate increases noticeably. Your hands might tremble slightly. You feel wired, not just awake. And here's the problem. Dose matters. A lot. In traditional Chinese medicine, mahuang was brewed as tea, and the concentration of ephedrine in that tea was relatively low and buffered by other plant compounds. You'd get maybe 20 to 30 milligrams of ephedrine per cup, and you'd sip it slowly. That's manageable. But once chemists started isolating pure ephedrine and cramming it into pills, dosages shot up. 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams, sometimes more. Your body, which evolved to handle occasional surges of adrenaline during actual emergencies, suddenly had to cope with chemical stimulation several times a day, every day. The side effects became obvious: anxiety, insomnia, rapid heartbeat, elevated blood pressure, and in extreme cases, heart attacks and strokes. People died. Not many at first, but enough. And still, pharmaceutical companies kept selling it because it worked, and people kept buying it because they wanted to lose weight, stay awake, or perform better. The chemistry was sound. The ethics, not so much. But the real danger of ephedrine wasn't what it did on its own. It was what it could become. Because chemists looking at the molecular structure of ephedrine saw something fascinating. It was remarkably similar to amphetamine, just with one extra oxygen atom. And if you knew what you were doing in a lab, or even in a basement with the right equipment, you could strip that oxygen away and create something far more potent, far more addictive, and far more dangerous. Ephedrine was the key. Methamphetamine was the door it unlocked. And once that door opened, there was no closing it again. In the late 19th century, Western scientists began scouring the world for exotic medicines to study, dissect, and industrialize. Enter Japanese chemist Nagai Nagayoshi, who in 1887 became the first to isolate pure ephedrine from ephedra plants. Suddenly, what had been a traditional remedy became a laboratory specimen. By the 1920s, American and European pharmaceutical companies were synthesizing ephedrine in bulk, bottling it into pills, and marketing it as a modern miracle drug for asthma, hay fever, and nasal congestion. It was clean, it was scientific, and it worked. But in their rush to profit, no one paused to ask, what happens when you take a stimulant this powerful and hand it to a society obsessed with speed, productivity, and staying ahead? Nagai Nagayoshi wasn't looking to create a drug empire. He was a chemist, trained in Germany, working in Japan at a time when the country was modernizing rapidly and hungry for scientific advancement. He'd heard about mahuang from Chinese medicine, and like many scientists of his era, he was curious whether traditional remedies contained real, measurable compounds or just placebo effects wrapped in superstition. So he took ephedra stems, ground them up, and began the painstaking process of extraction and purification. And in 1887 he succeeded. Pure ephedrine, crystallized and isolated. It was elegant work. Nagai published his findings, but they didn't make much of a splash initially. Ephedrine was interesting, sure, but it wasn't revolutionary, not yet. That changed in the 1920s when American chemist K.K. Chen and pharmacologist Carl Schmidt rediscovered ephedrine and began testing it rigorously. They administered it to animals, measured its effects on blood pressure and respiration, and quickly realized they'd stumbled onto something commercially valuable. Chen, working at the University of Wisconsin, ran clinical trials on human subjects, mostly asthmatics, and the results were undeniable. Ephedrine worked as well as, and sometimes better than, adrenaline injections, which had been the standard treatment. But here's the kicker. Unlike adrenaline, which had to be injected and only work for a short time, ephedrine could be taken orally and lasted for hours. That was huge. It meant patients could take a pill at breakfast and breathe freely all day. For pharmaceutical companies, it meant a product they could mass produce, bottle, and sell to millions of people suffering from asthma, hay fever, and sinus congestion. The market potential was enormous. By the late 1920s, companies like Eli Lilly and Merck were synthesizing ephedrine and selling it under various brand names. It appeared in nasal inhalers, tablets, syrups, anything you could swallow, spray, or inhale. Doctors prescribed it liberally because, frankly, it worked, and the side effects seemed manageable at first. Sure, patients sometimes complained of jitteriness or trouble sleeping, but compared to gasping for air, a little insomnia seemed like a fair trade. But Western medicine made a critical error. They treated ephedrine like a simple chemical fix, stripping it from its cultural and medical context. In traditional Chinese medicine, mahuang was never given alone. It was always part of a formula, balanced with other herbs to moderate its stimulating effects. Practitioners carefully assessed each patient's constitution before prescribing it, and it was used short-term for acute conditions, not as a daily medication. Western doctors, by contrast, handed out ephedrine pills like candy, often for chronic conditions, and with little regard for long-term effects. Meanwhile, chemists were busy tinkering. If ephedrine was this effective, what else could they make? In 1919, a Japanese chemist named Akira Ogata took ephedrine and synthesized methamphetamine from it. He wasn't trying to create a street drug. He was exploring the structure-activity relationship of stimulants, a fancy way of saying he wanted to see what happened if you tweaked the molecule slightly. What he created was a compound that was more potent, more euphoric, and far more dangerous than ephedrine. At the time, it seemed like a footnote. It wouldn't stay that way. By the 1930s, ephedrine was everywhere in Western medicine. It had gone from obscure Chinese herb to pharmaceutical blockbuster in less than 50 years. But the scientists who celebrated its discovery didn't realize they'd also handed the world a blueprint. Ephedrine wasn't just a medicine. It was a precursor, a starting point, a gateway. And the door it opened would lead not just to better treatments, but to addiction, black markets, and one of the most devastating drug epidemics in modern history. The plant that had healed for thousands of years was about to become the foundation of something that destroyed. Ephedrine was effective, but it had limitations. It required plants, extraction, and processing. Chemists wanted something stronger, cheaper, and easier to mass produce. In 1927, Romanian chemist Lazar Edeleanu synthesized amphetamine, a close chemical relative of ephedrine, but entirely man-made. It didn't need plants, it just needed a lab. Amphetamine was marketed under the brand name benzedrine in the 1930s, first as an inhaler for nasal congestion, then as a pill for everything from narcolepsy to depression. Truckers used it to stay awake, students used it to cram, housewives used it to lose weight, and no one called it dangerous. They called it progress. Actually, let's back up for a second. Lazar Edeleanu first synthesized amphetamine way earlier, in 1887, the same year ephedrine was isolated. But here's the twist. Nobody cared. Edeleanu made it as part of his doctoral research in Germany, noted its chemical structure, and then nothing. It sat on a shelf, a chemical curiosity with no obvious use. For decades, amphetamine was just a footnote in organic chemistry textbooks, a molecule that existed but didn't matter, until it did. Fast forward to the 1920s and 30s, when pharmaceutical companies were racing to develop new stimulants and decongestants. Ephedrine was selling well, but it had downsides. It required raw plant material, which meant dealing with supply chains, harvests, and quality control. What if you could make something similar, but entirely synthetic? No plants, no middlemen, just pure chemistry. Enter Gordon Alice, an American chemist working for Smith, Kline and French, which would later become GlaxoSmithKline. In 1929, Alice was researching alternatives to ephedrine when he revisited Italiano's forgotten amphetamine. He synthesized a batch, and then, in a move that would be wildly unethical today, he tested it on himself. Alice injected 50 milligrams of amphetamine and waited. What he felt was remarkable. Intense alertness, euphoria, boundless energy, and a sense of clarity that lasted for hours. He also noted side effects: rapid heartbeat, dilated pupils, restlessness, but the positives seemed to outweigh the negatives. Alice knew he'd found something marketable. By the early 1930s, Smith, Kline and French began selling amphetamine under the brand name benzedrine. Initially it was marketed as an inhaler for nasal congestion and asthma. Just crack open the inhaler, take a sniff, and your sinuses cleared right up. It smelled medicinal, looked legitimate, and sold briskly. But people quickly figured out that you didn't have to just sniff it. You could crack open the inhaler, pull out the amphetamine-soaked cotton strip inside, soak it in coffee or soda, and drink it. Boom, instant energy drink, 1930s style. The pharmaceutical companies noticed. If people wanted amphetamine for energy, why not just sell it as pills? By the mid-30s, benzedrine tablets were on the market, prescribed for an absurdly wide range of conditions: depression, narcolepsy, hyperactivity in children, yes really, obesity, and even to counteract the sedative effects of other medications. Got a problem? There's a pill for that, and it's called speed. Doctors handed out amphetamine prescriptions like they were vitamins. Students used it to pull all-nighters. Truck drivers used it to stay alert on long hauls across empty highways. Housewives, especially, were targeted with ads promising weight loss and boundless energy to keep up with cooking, cleaning and childcare. One ad from the era literally shows a smiling woman vacuuming with the tagline, "Stay slim and energetic with benzedrine." The subtext was clear. Modern women needed chemical assistance to meet modern demands. And it worked. Amphetamine did exactly what it promised. You lost weight because it killed your appetite. You stayed awake because it flooded your brain with dopamine and norepinephrine. You felt confident, productive, unstoppable, at least for a while. The crash came later. Irritability, exhaustion, depression, paranoia. But by then, the solution seemed obvious. Take another pill. By the late 1930s, millions of Americans were using amphetamines, most of them legally, many of them with the doctor's blessing. It was normalized, medicalized, and celebrated as a triumph of modern science. No one was calling it addiction. They called it treatment. They called it enhancement. They called it living better through chemistry. But beneath the glossy ads and the glowing testimonials, a darker pattern was emerging. Tolerance, dependence, and a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, giving everyone access to synthetic adrenaline wasn't the best idea. Still, the genie was out of the bottle. Amphetamines were cheap, effective, and wildly profitable. And when the Second World War erupted, the military took one look at amphetamines and thought, what if we gave this to soldiers? What followed was one of the largest pharmacological experiments in history, conducted not in labs but on battlefields, with millions of young men as test subjects. When the Second World War erupted, nations on all sides needed one thing above all: soldiers who didn't sleep. Enter amphetamines. The Allies called them pep pills, the Germans called them Pervitin, the Japanese called them Philipon. But they all did the same thing. They kept soldiers alert, aggressive, and operational for days on end. Pilots flew longer missions, infantrymen marched further, tank crews stayed sharp through endless nights. Millions of pills were distributed, sometimes handed out like candy. But when the war ended, those soldiers came home, and the pills didn't stop. The world had been introduced to chemical endurance, and it liked what it felt. The genie was out of the bottle, and it wasn't going back in. Let's start with Germany, because they went all in on amphetamines before anyone else. In 1938, the German pharmaceutical company Temmler Werk began mass-producing methamphetamine under the brand name Pervitin. It was marketed to the public as a mood enhancer and productivity booster, available over the counter in chocolates, tablets, and even as part of care packages sent to soldiers. Yes, you could buy meth chocolates at the corner store. Wild times. But the German military saw Pervitin's real potential. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, required speed, aggression, and relentless forward momentum. Soldiers needed to march for days, fight without rest, and push through exhaustion that would normally cripple them. Pervitin was the answer. The Wehrmacht distributed millions of tablets to troops during the invasion of Poland and France. Tank commanders popped pills to stay alert through 72-hour operations. Pilots took them before bombing raids. Even Hitler himself received regular injections of methamphetamine from his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, though that's a whole other disturbing chapter. The results were immediate and terrifying. German forces moved faster and fought harder than their enemies expected. But the side effects, equally brutal. Soldiers became paranoid, aggressive, and reckless. Some experienced full psychotic breaks. Others collapsed from exhaustion once the drugs wore off. By 1941, the German military began restricting Pervitin use because too many soldiers were becoming dependent or breaking down entirely. But the damage was done. Methamphetamine had proven itself as a weapon of war. The Allies weren't far behind. British and American forces issued amphetamine tablets, usually benzedrine, to pilots, sailors, and infantrymen. The US military alone distributed an estimated 200 million amphetamine tablets during the war. Bomber crews flying nighttime raids over Germany took go pills to stay sharp through missions that lasted 10, 12, sometimes 15 hours. Soldiers storming beaches or holding defensive positions took them to fight through fear and fatigue. It wasn't just about staying awake. Amphetamines made soldiers more aggressive, more willing to take risks, and less afraid of death. In the chaos of combat, that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. But it also meant young men, barely out of their teens, were chemically altered and sent into hell. They fought wars fueled not just by ideology or duty, but by synthetic stimulants that rewired their brains. Japan too embraced amphetamines. Philipon, essentially methamphetamine, was distributed widely to kamikaze pilots, factory workers, and soldiers. The logic was simple. A nation fighting for survival couldn't afford to let exhaustion slow it down, so they chemically overrode it, and it worked until it didn't. When the war ended in 1945, millions of soldiers returned home, but they didn't leave the pills behind. Many were addicted or had developed a taste for the focus and energy amphetamines provided. Veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, and for some, amphetamines became a crutch, a way to cope with trauma, boredom, or the simple fact that normal life felt unbearably slow after years of chemical intensity. Pharmaceutical companies, meanwhile, found themselves with warehouses full of surplus amphetamines. What do you do with millions of pills originally made for war? You rebrand them for peace. And that's exactly what happened. The same drugs that kept soldiers fighting were now marketed to housewives, students, and workers as productivity enhancers, diet pills, and mood lifters. The war had ended, but the chemical march continued, and no one, not doctors, not governments, not the companies making billions, seemed interested in asking whether this was a good idea. The soldiers came home, but the speed stayed, and it was just getting started. After 1945, warehouses across the globe were stuffed with leftover military amphetamines. Tons of them. What do you do with millions of stimulant pills designed for war? You rebrand them for peace. Pharmaceutical companies pivoted hard, marketing amphetamines as diet pills, mood enhancers, and productivity boosters. Housewives were told it would help them slim down and keep up with housework. Students were told it would sharpen their focus. Workers were told it would make them more efficient, and it worked for a while. But dependents crept in quietly, dressed in cheerful advertisements and doctors' prescriptions. America in particular fell in love with speed. By the 1960s, an estimated 10% of American adults had used amphetamines, and still, no one called it an epidemic. They called it modern living. Picture this. It's 1950, and you're a housewife in suburban America. Your husband works 9 to 5. You've got 3 kids, a house to clean, meals to cook, laundry to wash, and absolutely zero time for yourself. You're exhausted, and honestly, you're not sure you can keep up. Then your doctor, a respected man in a white coat, writes your prescription for something called Dexedrine or Obertrol or one of a dozen other brand names. It'll help with your energy, he says, and you'll lose a few pounds too. You take the pill. Within an hour, you feel amazing. The fog lifts. You clean the house in record time. You're cheerful, efficient, and suddenly the day doesn't feel impossible anymore. This was the pitch, and millions of women bought it. Amphetamines were rebranded as Mother's Little Helpers, a term that would later inspire a Rolling Stones song, though they were singing about Valium, another overprescribed medication of the era. The 1950s and 60s were the golden age of pharmaceutical optimism, a time when doctors believed chemistry could solve almost any problem, and patients trusted them implicitly. Diet pills were especially popular. Brand names like Dexedrine, benzedrine, and later Dexamyl, a combination of amphetamine and barbiturate. Yes, an upper and a downer in one pill because what could go wrong, flew off pharmacy shelves. The message was clear. Being overweight was a problem, and amphetamines were the solution. Never mind that the weight loss was temporary and driven by appetite suppression and hyperactivity. Never mind that the pills were addictive. They worked, and that was enough. Students discovered amphetamines too. College campuses in the 50s and 60s were full of kids popping bennies, slang for benzedrine, to cram for exams or finish term papers at 3 a.m. It became part of the culture, almost a rite of passage. Everyone knew someone who had a stash, and sharing pills was as casual as lending a textbook. Amphetamines weren't seen as drugs, they were study aids, performance enhancers, tools for success in an increasingly competitive world. Truck drivers, meanwhile, had been using amphetamines since the war, and they kept using them. Long-haul routes across America's vast highway system demanded alertness for hours, sometimes days. Drivers called the pills West Coast turnarounds because you could drive from coast to coast and back without sleeping. It was dangerous, sure, but it was also profitable. Companies didn't ask questions as long as deliveries arrived on time. Athletes used them. Soldiers continued using them. Factory workers used them. By the early 1960s, amphetamines were everywhere, prescribed for conditions as varied as obesity, depression, fatigue, narcolepsy, hyperactivity, and even alcoholism. Doctors handed out prescriptions with barely a second thought. After all, pharmaceutical companies assured them these drugs were safe, non-addictive, and scientifically proven. Spoiler alert, they were none of those things. The first cracks began to show in the late 50s and early 60s. Reports started emerging of people, mostly women, who couldn't stop taking their diet pills. They tried to quit and experience crushing fatigue, depression and weight gain, so they'd start taking them again. Tolerance built up, meaning they needed higher doses to feel the same effects. Some people were taking 10, 20, even 50 pills a day, far beyond any prescribed amount. Doctors began noticing patterns: paranoia, aggression, insomnia, heart problems. Emergency rooms saw overdoses. A few deaths made headlines. But the response was slow. Pharmaceutical companies downplayed the risks. Doctors kept prescribing, and patients kept taking them because, frankly, the alternative, facing exhaustion, weight gain, or simply being normal, felt worse. By the mid-60s, the US was consuming more amphetamines per capita than any other country on Earth. It wasn't an epidemic yet, not officially, but the stage was set. The pills that had won a war were now quietly colonizing peacetime America, one prescription at a time. And beneath the surface, in basements and back rooms, a new kind of user was emerging, people who weren't getting their speed from doctors, but from dealers. The black market was growing, and methamphetamine, the stronger, dirtier cousin of pharmaceutical amphetamines, was waiting in the wings. While America flirted with amphetamines, Japan plunged headlong into a methamphetamine nightmare. After the war, surplus Philopon flooded the black market. It was cheap, potent, and everywhere. By the early 1950s, an estimated 2 million Japanese citizens were addicted. The drug tore through society: factory workers, students, even children. Crime skyrocketed. Families shattered. The government, slow to react, finally cracked down with harsh penalties and public health campaigns. But the damage was done. Japan's post-war meth crisis became a cautionary tale, one the rest of the world should have studied closely. Instead, they repeated it. Let's set the scene. It's 1945. Japan has just surrendered. The country is in ruins, cities bombed to rubble, economy shattered, millions dead. The social order that held Japan together for centuries has collapsed. Into this chaos, methamphetamine arrives like a ghost from the war. During the conflict, Japanese pharmaceutical companies had produced massive quantities of Vilapon, literally love of work, to keep soldiers, pilots, and factory workers operating at superhuman levels. Now, with the war over, those companies had warehouses full of the stuff and no military to sell it to, so they sold it to civilians, legally, over the counter. You could walk into a pharmacy in 1946 Tokyo and buy methamphetamine tablets without a prescription. The marketing was shameless. Eliminate drowsiness and recharge your spirit. Fight fatigue and conquer your day. The ad showed smiling workers, energetic, students, happy families. No one mentioned addiction. No one mentioned psychosis. At first, it seemed harmless, even helpful. Japan was rebuilding, and people were desperate for any edge they could get. Factory workers took Philopon to work double shifts. Students took it to study through the night. Even housewives took it to manage the overwhelming demands of post-war survival. The drug delivered on its promises. You did feel more energetic, more focused, more capable, for a while. But methamphetamine is a demon in disguise. It doesn't just borrow energy from your future self, it steals it, and it demands interest. By the late 1940s, Japan's meth use had exploded. An estimated 500,000 people were regular users by 1950, and that number would quadruple within a few years. And these weren't just casual users. Many were deeply addicted, taking the drug daily, sometimes multiple times a day, chasing a high that kept receding. The social effects were catastrophic. Crime rates soared. Meth users, paranoid and aggressive, committed assaults, robberies and murders at shocking rates. Families disintegrated as parents became addicts, unable to care for their children. Hospitals filled with people suffering from meth-induced psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, violent outbursts. Some believed they were being followed by invisible enemies. Others tore at their own skin, convinced insects were crawling underneath. The Japanese government, which had initially allowed Philipon to be sold legally, was slow to respond. Partially because they didn't fully understand the scale of the problem, and partially because pharmaceutical companies, powerful and politically connected, lobbied against restrictions. But by the early 1950s, the crisis was undeniable. Newspapers ran daily stories about meth-fueled violence. Citizens demanded action. In 1951, Japan passed the Stimulants Control Law, banning the production, sale, and possession of methamphetamine. It was one of the strictest drug laws in the world at the time, with harsh penalties including long prison sentences. The government also launched a massive public health campaign, plastering cities with posters warning about the dangers of drug psychosis and the destruction meth caused. The crackdown worked, sort of. By the mid-1950s, meth use had declined significantly. But the cost was enormous. Tens of thousands of people were arrested and incarcerated. Communities were traumatized. And even as use dropped, the black market didn't disappear. It just went underground, waiting for the next opportunity. Japan's meth epidemic was a warning, a vivid, brutal example of what happens when a powerful stimulant is mass-produced, widely distributed, and socially normalized. It showed that methamphetamine doesn't just hurt individuals, it destabilizes entire societies. But the lesson was lost on the rest of the world. America, Europe, and other nations watched Japan's crisis from a distance, shook their heads, and assumed it couldn't happen to them. They were wrong. The same patterns, pharmaceutical overproduction, casual use, addiction, crime, social collapse, would repeat in different countries, different decades, different languages, but the drug was always the same, and the ending was always tragic. By the 1970s, the cracks were showing. Amphetamine addiction was no longer a fringe issue, it was mainstream. The American Medical Association warned of widespread abuse, emergency rooms filled with overdoses. The FDA, under mounting pressure, reclassified amphetamines as controlled substances in 1971. Prescriptions tightened, legal production dropped. For a moment, it seemed like the crisis might be contained. But addiction doesn't disappear when you regulate supply. It just finds a new source. And in the shadows, chemists were already experimenting with something stronger, cheaper, and far more dangerous. Methamphetamine synthesized not from plants, but from cold medicine. The turning point came in 1970, when Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act. This law created a scheduling system for drugs based on their medical use and potential for abuse. Amphetamines were placed in Schedule 2, meaning they were recognized as having legitimate medical uses, but also high potential for abuse and addiction. Suddenly, doctors couldn't hand out prescriptions as freely. Pharmacies had to track every pill, and pharmaceutical companies faced stricter regulations on production and distribution. The impact was immediate. Prescription amphetamine use plummeted. The diet pill industry, which had raked in billions during the 50s and 60s, collapsed almost overnight. Pharmaceutical companies scrambled to find alternatives, leading to the development of drugs like fenfluramine, later part of the disastrous fen-phen combination, and eventually medications like Adderall, which is still amphetamine but marketed more carefully. For a brief moment, it looked like America had dodged a bullet. Legal amphetamine use was down, overdoses decreased, public health officials cautiously celebrated, but they'd made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that regulating legal supply would end the demand. It didn't. All those people who'd been using amphetamines, students, truckers, workers, dieters, didn't suddenly stop wanting the drug. They just couldn't get it from doctors anymore, so they turned to the black market, and the black market was ready. Throughout the 1960s, outlaw chemists had been experimenting with homemade amphetamines and methamphetamine. They didn't need pharmaceutical labs. They just needed basic chemistry knowledge, some equipment, and access to the right precursor chemicals. And in the early 1970s, they found the perfect precursor, pseudoephedrine, the active ingredient in over-the-counter cold medicines like Sudafed. Pseudoephedrine, remember, is chemically related to ephedrine and methamphetamine. With the right process, dangerous, toxic, but relatively simple, a chemist could convert pseudoephedrine into methamphetamine. The recipe began circulating in underground chemistry circles, passed from biker to biker, dealer to dealer. And because pseudoephedrine was legal and available in every drugstore, the supply was virtually unlimited. The FDA's crackdown on prescription amphetamines had an unintended consequence. It pushed the problem underground and made it worse. Legal pharmaceutical-grade amphetamines, for all their risks, were at least pure and dose-controlled. Illegal meth made in bathtubs and trailer parks? Not so much. Purity varied wildly. Toxic byproducts from sloppy chemistry poisoned users. And because there were no regulations, no oversight, and no quality control, people died. By the late 70s, meth was spreading, especially in the American West. Biker gangs, particularly the Hells Angels, became the first major manufacturers and distributors. They called it crank, allegedly because they hid it in motorcycle crankcases during transport. It was cheaper than cocaine, longer lasting, and easier to make, and demand was growing. The FDA had tried to close the door, but they'd only managed to crack it halfway. Amphetamines were harder to get legally, but methamphetamine was easier to get illegally. The drug hadn't gone away. It had just changed forms, moved into the shadows, and started evolving into something far more dangerous. The war on drugs was beginning, but the drugs were winning. When legal amphetamines became harder to get, underground chemists stepped in. They didn't need pharmaceutical labs or government approval. They just needed pseudoephedrine, the active ingredient in over-the-counter cold medicine, and a few dangerous chemicals. The recipe was shockingly simple, taught in biker gang clubhouses, scribbled on napkins, passed around like samizdat. Suddenly methamphetamine wasn't a prescription drug anymore. It was a basement operation, a garage side hustle, a backwoods empire. And because it was illegal, there were no quality controls, no purity standards, no safety measures, just profit, paranoia, and a product that could be cooked in a kitchen and sold on a street corner. The genie wasn't just out of the bottle, it had learned to cook. Let's talk about what it actually takes to make methamphetamine in a clandestine lab. First, you need pseudoephedrine. Easy. Just walk into any pharmacy and buy boxes of cold medicine. In the 1980s and 90s, there were no purchase limits. You could buy as much as you wanted, no questions asked. So meth cooks would hit multiple stores, buying hundreds of boxes at a time, or they'd recruit smurfs, people paid to go store to store buying small amounts to avoid suspicion. Next, you need chemicals. Red phosphorus, iodine, hydrochloric acid, lithium strips, often pulled from batteries, anhydrous ammonia, stolen from farms, and various solvents like acetone or ether. Some of these are legal to purchase in small quantities. Others have to be stolen or bought on the black market. None of them are safe. Red phosphorus is flammable. Anhydrous ammonia is corrosive and can cause severe burns. Ether is extremely volatile and explosive. You're basically working with a chemistry set designed to kill you. The cooking process itself is a toxic, dangerous ballet. There are several methods: the Nazi method, the red pea method, the birch reduction using lithium and ammonia, but they all involve combining pseudoephedrine with these hazardous chemicals, heating them, and carefully controlling reactions that produce toxic fumes, explosive gases and flammable liquids. One wrong move, a spark, a spill, a miscalculation, and the entire lab can explode or catch fire. And they did. Constantly. Throughout the 80s and 90s, news reports were filled with stories of meth labs exploding in trailer parks, motels, and rural homes. Buildings would burst into flames. People were burned, maimed, or killed. Emergency responders arriving at the scene had to wear hazmat suits because the toxic chemicals lingered for days, poisoning the air, soil, and water. But despite the dangers, people kept cooking because the profit margins were insane. A few $100s worth of pseudoephedrine and chemicals could produce thousands of dollars worth of meth. For people in economically depressed areas with few job prospects, it was tempting, a way to make serious money without leaving town. The downside: prison, addiction, death, or all three. The cooks themselves were a varied bunch. Some were trained chemists who'd turned to crime. Others were high school dropouts who learned the process through trial, error, and occasional fatalities. Biker gangs controlled much of the early production, but by the 90s, independent operators were everywhere, especially in rural America. All you needed was a trailer, a recipe, and a willingness to risk your life. The meth these labs produced was often impure, contaminated with leftover chemicals and toxic byproducts. Users didn't care. It was cheap, it worked, and it was available. But the impurities caused additional health problems: corroded teeth, skin sores, organ damage. The meth epidemic wasn't just an addiction crisis, it was a poisoning crisis. Law enforcement struggled to keep up. Every time they busted a lab, 2 more popped up. The cooks were mobile, often setting up in remote locations, abandoned buildings, or even moving vehicles. And because the ingredients were legal and the process could be done quickly, it was nearly impossible to shut down the supply. By the 2000s, small-scale meth labs were everywhere in rural America, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Tennessee. Law enforcement called it the meth belt. Entire communities were affected. Children were found living in homes filled with toxic fumes. Forests were contaminated by dumped chemicals. The environmental and social damage was staggering. The kitchen chemists had turned Ephedra's ancient legacy into a modern nightmare, and there was no easy way to stop them. In the 1960s and 70s, outlaw motorcycle clubs like the Hells Angels became the first major distributors of homemade methamphetamine in America. They called it crank, allegedly because it was hidden in motorcycle crankcases during transport. Bikers didn't just sell it, they controlled its production and distribution networks across the West Coast. It was a perfect fit. A drug that kept you awake, aggressive and fearless, matched the outlaw biker lifestyle. But as demand grew, the market expanded beyond clubhouses and dive bars. Meth started reaching truck stops, rural towns, and eventually suburban homes. What began as a subculture drug was creeping into the mainstream, and no one in power seemed to notice or care until it was far too late. The Hells Angels weren't just users or casual dealers. They were industrial-level manufacturers and distributors, running what amounted to a criminal pharmaceutical company. They had chemists, some self-taught, others with actual training, who could cook high-quality meth in bulk. They had distribution networks that stretched across California, Nevada, Oregon, and beyond. And they had enforcers who made sure nobody messed with their operation. Why meth? Because it fit the lifestyle. Outlaw bikers valued toughness, endurance, and a certain reckless intensity. Meth delivered all three. It kept you awake for days during long rides or runs. It made you aggressive and fearless, useful traits in a world where violence was always simmering, and it bonded the club together in a shared chemical experience. Meth wasn't just business, it was culture. By the 1970s, the Hells Angels and other clubs like the Outlaws and Pagans controlled much of the meth trade in America. They cooked it in hidden labs, often in rural areas or industrial buildings. They transported it in motorcycle saddlebags, car trunks, and yes, crankcases. And they sold it through a network of affiliated dealers, many of whom were hang-arounds or prospects trying to earn their way into the club. The quality of biker meth was generally higher than what you'd get from random kitchen chemists. These guys had refined the process, learned from mistakes, and invested in better equipment. They weren't just slapping together a batch in a trailer. They were running professional operations, and because they controlled both production and distribution, they could keep prices competitive and supply consistent. But as meth spread beyond biker circles, things started to change. Truckers discovered it and loved it. A drug that kept you awake on long hauls was perfect for the job. Construction workers, factory labourers and other blue-collar workers started using it to power through grueling shifts. College students experimented with it. And slowly, meth crept into suburban communities, carried by word of mouth and a growing network of dealers who had no connection to the biker world. By the 1980s, the biker gangs still controlled a large chunk of the meth trade, but they were losing their monopoly. Independent cooks were popping up everywhere, using the same recipes but without the organisational structure or quality control. The market was fracturing, and with that fracturing came chaos. More labs, more explosions, more toxic waste, more addiction. Law enforcement began targeting the biker gangs hard. Major busts in the 80s and 90s dismantled some of the biggest operations. Club members were arrested, labs were raided, and for a moment it seemed like the biker meth empire was collapsing. But the demand didn't go away, and into the vacuum stepped a new player, one that would dwarf the biker gangs in scale, sophistication, and sheer brutality. The Mexican drug cartels. The bikers had introduced meth to America. The cartels would industrialize it. Methamphetamine floods the brain with dopamine, up to 1,200% more than natural rewards like food or sex. That surge creates euphoria, but it also damages the brain's reward system. Over time, the brain stops producing dopamine naturally. Nothing feels good anymore except meth. Users aren't chasing a high, they're chasing normalcy. And that's what makes meth so insidious. It doesn't just offer pleasure, it steals the ability to feel pleasure from anything else. To understand why meth is so devastatingly addictive, you need to understand dopamine. It's not just a pleasure chemical, though that's how it's often described. Dopamine is more accurately a motivation and reward learning neurotransmitter. It tells your brain, this thing you just did, remember it. It's important for survival. Do it again. Eating releases dopamine, sex releases dopamine. Sex, accomplishing a goal, releases dopamine. It's the brain's way of reinforcing behaviours that keep you alive and help you reproduce. Natural rewards increase dopamine levels by maybe 50 to 100% above baseline. That's enough to make you feel satisfied, to make you remember that pizza was delicious or that finishing a project felt good. Your brain files that information away and motivates you to repeat the behaviour. But here's the crucial part. The dopamine surge is temporary and proportional. Your brain returns to baseline, and life continues normally. Methamphetamine doesn't play by these rules. When you use meth, especially when you smoke or inject it, dopamine levels skyrocket by 1,200% or more. That's not a typo. 1,200%. Your brain is suddenly flooded with more reward signal than it ever evolved to handle. The euphoria is overwhelming, beyond anything natural life can provide. It's like experiencing every good thing that's ever happened to you all at once, amplified tenfold. But your brain isn't equipped to handle this chemical tsunami. The dopamine receptors, the structures on neurons that respond to dopamine, become overwhelmed. In response, your brain begins to downregulate, meaning it reduces the number of receptors and makes the remaining ones less sensitive. It's a defense mechanism, like turning down the volume when music is too loud. Except in this case, turning down the volume has catastrophic consequences. Now your brain requires massive amounts of dopamine just to feel normal. Regular activities, a good meal, a conversation with a friend, watching a sunset, no longer register as pleasurable because the signal is too weak. The receptors have been recalibrated to meth-level dopamine, and nothing else comes close. This is called anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, and it's one of the cruelest aspects of meth addiction. Users describe it as living in a grey world where nothing matters and nothing feels good. Food tastes like cardboard. Music is just noise. Laughter sounds hollow. Even things that used to bring intense joy, seeing your children, achieving a goal, physical intimacy, feel empty. The only thing that can penetrate this emotional numbness is more meth. And that's the trap. You're not using to get high anymore. You're using to feel anything at all. This isn't a moral failing or a lack of willpower. It's neuroscience. The brain has been physically altered. MRI studies of chronic meth users show reduced grey matter in regions associated with decision-making, impulse control, and emotion regulation. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that says, "This is a bad idea, don't do it," is impaired. That's why people continue using meth even when they rationally know it's destroying their lives. The part of their brain that could stop them has been damaged by the very drug they're trying to quit. There's also a cognitive component. Meth causes significant damage to dopamine and serotonin neurons. Studies show that chronic users have impaired memory, difficulty concentrating, and problems with executive function, the ability to plan, organize, and execute tasks. These cognitive deficits make daily life harder, which creates stress, which triggers cravings. It's a vicious cycle. The craving mechanism itself is powerful and persistent. Even after months or years of sobriety, certain triggers, a place, a person, a smell, a stressful situation, can activate neural pathways associated with meth use. The brain remembers. It remembers that meth solved problems, made you feel powerful, brought relief, and it whispers just once more. These cravings can be intense and sudden, ambushing people in early recovery when they're most vulnerable. The good news, if there is any, is that the brain can heal. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize and form new neural connections, means that dopamine receptors can partially regenerate with sustained abstinence. Studies show that after about 14 months of sobriety, brain function begins to improve significantly. Memory gets better, decision-making improves, and crucially, the ability to feel pleasure from natural rewards starts to return. But 14 months is a long time when every day feels grey and meaningless. That's why treatment needs to address not just the drug use but the underlying neuroscience. Behavioral therapies help people retrain their reward systems, finding new sources of satisfaction and meaning. Support networks provide the external motivation and structure when internal motivation is damaged. And time, patient, difficult time, allows the brain to slowly, painfully begin to heal. Methamphetamine doesn't just borrow happiness from your future, it rewrites your brain's understanding of what happiness is. And undoing that damage requires more than willpower. It requires rewiring yourself from the inside out. How do you fight meth addiction? The debate rages. Abstinence-only programs demand complete sobriety. Harm reduction advocates argue for needle exchanges, safe consumption sites, and meeting users where they are. Both sides claim lives saved. Both sides point to failures. What's clear is that one-size-fits-all doesn't work. Meth addiction is complex, rooted in trauma, poverty, and biology. Effective treatment requires flexibility, compassion, and resources, three things often in short supply. The abstinence-only model is straightforward in its philosophy. The only acceptable goal is complete, permanent cessation of drug use. This approach dominates much of American addiction treatment, rooted in the 12-step tradition of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. The logic is simple. If drugs are destroying your life, the solution is to stop using drugs entirely. Abstinence programs emphasize personal responsibility, spiritual growth, and the belief that addiction is a chronic condition requiring lifelong vigilance. For many people, this approach works. The structure, community, and clear expectations of abstinence-based programs provide the framework they need to rebuild their lives. 12-step meetings are free, widely available, and offer a built-in support network. The program's emphasis on service, helping others in recovery, gives people purpose and accountability. Thousands of people have gotten clean and stayed clean through these programs. But abstinence-only approaches have significant limitations. They often struggle with people who relapse repeatedly or who aren't ready to commit to complete sobriety. In many abstinence-based programs, any drug use is considered failure, which can shame people out of returning for help. There's also the issue of accessibility. Rural areas may have limited or no 12-step meetings, and not everyone connects with the spiritual components. Critics argue that demanding abstinence from people whose brains are chemically dependent on drugs is setting them up for failure. The relapse rates are high. Studies suggest anywhere from 40 to 60% of people relapse within the first year, regardless of treatment type. When relapse is treated as moral failure rather than a symptom of a chronic condition, people feel shame, hide their use, and avoid seeking help until they're in crisis. Enter harm reduction. This philosophy doesn't require abstinence as the starting point. Instead, it accepts that people use drugs and aims to minimize the harm associated with that use. Harm reduction strategies include needle exchanges, which provide clean syringes to prevent HIV and hepatitis transmission, safe consumption sites where people can use drugs under medical supervision to prevent overdose deaths, and fentanyl test strips that allow users to check whether their drugs are contaminated. The logic behind harm reduction is pragmatic. If someone isn't ready or able to quit using drugs, at least we can keep them alive until they are. A person who overdoses and dies can never get into recovery. A person who contracts HIV from a shared needle faces a lifetime of health complications. Harm reduction keeps people alive and connected to services, which creates opportunities for treatment when they're ready. Countries like Portugal, Switzerland, and Canada have embraced harm reduction with measurable success. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001 and shifted resources from incarceration to treatment and harm reduction. Drug-related deaths and HIV infections dropped dramatically. Switzerland's heroin-assisted treatment programs, where chronic users receive pharmaceutical-grade heroin in supervised settings, reduced crime, improved health outcomes, and helped people stabilize their lives even while still using. In North America, supervised consumption sites in cities like Vancouver showed similar results. People could use drugs safely, with medical staff available to intervene in overdoses. These sites also connected users to other services, housing, healthcare, mental health treatment, and eventually addiction treatment for those ready. Critics called them drug dens that enabled addiction. Supporters called them life-saving public health interventions. The data largely supported the latter. But harm reduction is controversial, especially in the United States. Critics argue it sends the wrong message, that drug use is acceptable, that society is giving up on people. They worry about the optics of government-funded sites where people use illegal drugs. Some believe harm reduction enables addiction by removing consequences. Supporters counter that morality has no place in public health. You don't withhold treatment because you disapprove of someone's choices. We treat lung cancer in smokers, liver disease in alcoholics, and heart disease in people who eat poorly. Why should addiction be different? Harm reduction isn't enabling addiction, it's acknowledging reality and responding with compassion. For methamphetamine specifically, harm reduction faces additional challenges. Unlike opioids, where naloxone can reverse overdoses instantly, there's no reversal drug for meth. Harm reduction for meth focuses on preventing infections from injection use, providing mental health support for meth-induced psychosis, and offering testing to identify contaminated supplies. The truth is, both approaches have merit and limitations. Some people need abstinence, the clear boundary, the structure, the community. Others need harm reduction, the flexibility, the compassion, the acknowledgement that recovery isn't linear. Many people benefit from a combination, starting with harm reduction to stabilize their lives, then transitioning to treatment and eventually abstinence if and when they're ready. The real problem isn't which philosophy is correct, it's that we're having a philosophical debate while people die from lack of access to any treatment at all. Rural areas have no resources, inner cities have waiting lists months long, insurance coverage is inadequate, and the people who need help most, the poor, the homeless, the mentally ill, are least able to navigate the fragmented, underfunded treatment system. Meth addiction doesn't care about philosophy. It cares about vulnerability, brain chemistry, and opportunity. Fighting it requires every tool available: abstinence-based programs for those they help, harm reduction for those who need it, medication-assisted treatment when it becomes available, and most importantly, the resources and political will to make treatment accessible to everyone who needs it. The debate rages on, but the clock keeps ticking, and people keep dying while we argue about the best way to save them. Meth doesn't spread randomly. It thrives where hope has died. In towns gutted by factory closures, in communities without jobs, healthcare, or opportunity. It offers an escape, however destructive. People don't choose meth because they're weak. They choose it because they're desperate. And until we address the systemic issues, poverty, lack of mental health care, economic abandonment, meth will keep finding fertile ground. There's a map you can overlay on America that's almost perfectly predictive. Take a map of meth use rates. Now overlay it with maps showing poverty rates, unemployment, lack of healthcare access, and declining populations. The correlation is striking. Meth flourishes in places where the American dream has become a bitter joke, where working hard doesn't guarantee survival, and where the future looks bleaker than the past. Let's talk about what economic despair actually looks like on the ground. Imagine a town in rural Kentucky or Missouri or Oklahoma. 50 years ago, there was a factory, furniture, textiles, mining, manufacturing that employed a significant portion of the working-age population. The jobs weren't glamorous, but they paid decent wages, offered benefits, and allowed people to own homes, raise families, and believe their children would have better lives. Then globalization happened. The factory closed, moved production overseas where labor was cheaper, or automated away the jobs. Suddenly, hundreds or thousands of people had no employment and no prospects. The local economy collapsed like a house of cards. Businesses on Main Street closed because nobody had money to spend. Property values plummeted. Young people left for cities, leaving behind aging populations and boarded-up buildings. What remains is profound despair, not just economic poverty, though that's real and crushing, but poverty of opportunity, of purpose, of hope. You're working 2 or 3 part-time minimum wage jobs just to afford rent and food with no benefits, no security, and no path forward. Your body hurts from physical labour, but you can't afford healthcare. Your kids are growing up in the same poverty you did, and you can't offer them anything better. The American dream of upward mobility has been replaced by the reality of just trying to survive. Into this vacuum, meth arrives like a false prophet. It offers energy when you're exhausted from working multiple jobs. It offers confidence when you feel powerless. It offers pleasure when life offers none. And most seductively, it offers escape, a chemical vacation from the grinding reality of poverty. For a few hours, you feel like the person you wish you were, capable, powerful, in control. This isn't to excuse meth use or minimize the harm it causes, but understanding why people use is critical to addressing the crisis. The moralizing narrative that people use drugs because they're weak or immoral misses the point entirely. Meth use is often a rational response to irrational circumstances. When your options are crushing depression from poverty or temporary euphoria from a drug, some people choose the drug. It's not a good choice, but it's an understandable one. The lack of mental health care exacerbates everything. Rural areas are mental health deserts. There are no therapists, no psychiatrists, no counsellors. If you're struggling with depression, anxiety, PTSD, or other mental illness, you're on your own. Self-medication becomes the default solution. Alcohol, pills, and increasingly meth become the treatment for untreated mental illness. The healthcare system more broadly has abandoned rural America. Hospitals close because they're not profitable. Doctors don't want to practice in isolated areas with poor infrastructure and low pay. Even when people have health problems, including addiction, they often have no access to treatment. The nearest addiction treatment centre might be 100 miles away, with no public transportation and a months-long waiting list. Social infrastructure has collapsed too. Churches, community centres, and civic organisations that once provided social connection and support have declined. People are isolated, disconnected from community. The social bonds that once helped people through difficult times have frayed. When you're isolated and struggling, drugs offer a chemical substitute for human connection. There's also the issue of systemic disinvestment. For decades, rural areas have been politically and economically sidelined. Infrastructure crumbles, roads full of potholes, bridges unsafe, broadband internet non-existent. Schools are underfunded, libraries close, parks deteriorate. The message is clear: you don't matter. Society has written you off. Compare this to how the crack epidemic was handled in inner cities. The response was militarized and punitive, mass incarceration, mandatory minimums, a war on drugs that was really a war on poor black communities. Tens of billions of dollars went to law enforcement and prisons, very little to treatment or addressing underlying causes like poverty and racism. The meth epidemic hit primarily white rural communities, and initially there was more sympathy and more emphasis on treatment over incarceration. But even that response was inadequate. Funding for treatment remained woefully insufficient. Rural areas were left to cope with minimal resources, and as the crisis dragged on and public sympathy waned, the response became increasingly punitive again. The uncomfortable truth is that America has created conditions where meth thrives. The economic policies that gutted manufacturing, the healthcare system that prioritizes profit over access, the political system that ignores rural voters except during election season, the cultural narrative that blames individuals for systemic failures, all of this creates fertile ground for addiction. Addressing the meth crisis requires addressing these root causes. That means economic investment in forgotten communities, not just poverty programs, but actual jobs with dignity and future prospects. It means universal health care that includes mental health and addiction treatment. It means rebuilding social infrastructure and community connections. It means acknowledging that people are suffering and responding with compassion rather than judgment. Meth didn't create poverty and despair. It found them already waiting. And until we address the conditions that make people desperate enough to risk everything for a few hours of chemical escape, meth, or the next drug or the next after that, will keep destroying lives. The plant that became a pill became a plague because we created a society where people need to escape, and that's on all of us. The meth epidemic costs billions annually. Emergency room visits, incarceration, child protective services, lost productivity. But the real cost isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in families torn apart, children raised by grandparents, communities paralyzed by fear. It's the invisible weight carried by those left behind. Let's start with the dollars, because those at least can be quantified. The Rand Corporation estimated that methamphetamine cost the United States approximately $23 billion annually in the early 2000s. That number has only grown. The costs come from multiple sources: healthcare for treating overdoses, infections, and chronic conditions caused by meth use, law enforcement expenses for arrests, investigations, and drug task forces, incarceration costs for housing meth offenders in prisons and jails, child welfare costs when parents can't care for their children, lost productivity when workers become addicted and can't maintain employment, and environmental cleanup costs for contaminated meth lab sites. Emergency rooms see the front lines of the meth crisis. Users arrive with overdoses, though meth overdoses look different from opioid overdoses. Instead of respiratory depression, you see hypothermia, dangerously elevated body temperature, cardiac arrhythmias, seizures, and strokes. Meth-induced psychosis brings violent, paranoid patients who require sedation and psychiatric intervention. Infections from injection drug use, abscesses, endocarditis, heart valve infection, sepsis require expensive treatment, often including surgery and long hospital stays. The dental costs alone are staggering. Meth mouth requires extensive dental reconstruction that can cost tens of thousands of dollars per person. Most meth users have no insurance and no ability to pay, so these costs are absorbed by emergency Medicaid or written off by hospitals and dentists. The taxpayer ultimately pays. Incarceration costs are enormous. Federal and state prisons house hundreds of thousands of people convicted of meth-related offences. It costs an average of $35,000 per year to incarcerate one person. Many are serving mandatory minimum sentences of 5, 10, or even 20 years for drug offences. That's hundreds of thousands of dollars per person, not counting the court costs, public defender fees, and probation expenses. And what do we get for those billions? Prisons full of non-violent drug offenders who emerge more traumatized and less employable than when they went in. Mass incarceration doesn't treat addiction, it warehouses it. When people are released, they return to the same communities, often with the same problems, plus a criminal record that makes employment nearly impossible. Child protective services bear an enormous burden. Meth-using parents often can't provide safe, stable homes for their children. The chaos of addiction, the erratic behaviour, the neglect, the dangerous environments puts children at risk. CPS removes children from homes, places them in foster care, and tries to reunite families when parents complete treatment. But the system is overwhelmed. There aren't enough foster homes, especially for sibling groups. Caseworkers are overworked and underpaid, and many parents never complete treatment because it's not accessible or available. Grandparents often step in. Across America, millions of grandparents are raising grandchildren because the parents are addicted, incarcerated, or dead. These grandparents are often elderly, on fixed incomes, and dealing with their own health issues. Suddenly they're parenting again, helping with homework, attending school functions, dealing with traumatized children who don't understand why mom and dad aren't there. It's exhausting, emotionally draining, and financially crippling. But they do it because the alternative is watching their grandchildren enter the foster system. The trauma inflicted on children is incalculable. Growing up with addicted parents means chaos, unpredictability, and often abuse or neglect. Children don't get their basic needs met: food, shelter, safety, attention. They witness disturbing behaviors. They may be exposed to drugs themselves or to dangerous people. The psychological damage lasts a lifetime. These children are more likely to struggle in school, develop mental health issues, and yes, become addicted themselves. Trauma perpetuates across generations. Communities suffer collectively. When meth ravages a town, social trust breaks down. People lock their doors. They don't trust their neighbours. Crime increases, petty theft, burglary, domestic violence. Property values drop because nobody wants to live in a town known for meth. Businesses leave. The tax base shrinks. Schools lose funding. It becomes a downward spiral. Poverty creates conditions for meth. Meth increases poverty, which creates more conditions for meth. First responders, police, firefighters, paramedics deal with constant trauma. They're responding to overdoses, domestic violence, child neglect cases, meth lab explosions, and violent psychotic episodes. They watch people die. They remove children from horrific conditions. They go home carrying those images. The burnout rate is high. PTSD is common. Some jurisdictions can't keep first responders because the work is too traumatizing and the pay too low. The economic productivity loss is real but hard to quantify. People in active addiction can't work reliably. They miss shifts, show up high, steal from employers, or simply can't hold jobs. Businesses in meth-affected areas struggle to find reliable workers. Some shut down entirely. The local economy suffers, which creates more unemployment, which creates more despair, which drives more drug use. Environmental costs from meth labs contaminate properties, making them uninhabitable without expensive remediation. Landowners are stuck with worthless property. In rural areas, chemicals dumped from labs poison groundwater and soil. Cleaning that up costs millions if it's done at all. But here's what the dollar figures don't capture. The mother who watches her son deteriorate from a vibrant young man into a hollow-eyed stranger. The siblings who grieve someone who's still alive but unreachable. The children who flinch at loud noises because they grew up in chaos. The grandmothers raising babies at 70. The towns where everyone knows someone who died, overdosed, or disappeared into addiction. You can't put a price tag on a destroyed life, a shattered family, a traumatized community. The real cost of meth isn't in budget spreadsheets or economic reports. It's in the accumulated grief of millions of people watching loved ones disappear into addiction, knowing help isn't available or isn't enough. It's in the weight of surviving when others didn't. It's in the question that haunts everyone touched by this crisis. Could I have done something different? And the terrible answer, probably not, because the system failed all of us. Meth-related offences carry harsh penalties, but mass incarceration hasn't stopped the crisis. Some states are experimenting with decriminalisation, focusing on treatment instead of prison. Others double down on punishment. The question remains, does locking up users solve anything, or does it just create more trauma? The legal response to methamphetamine has evolved over decades, generally in the wrong direction. In the 1980s and 90s, during the height of the war on drugs, lawmakers passed mandatory minimum sentencing laws for drug offences. The logic was deterrence. Make the penalties so severe that people would be too afraid to use or sell drugs. 5 grams of meth, 5 years mandatory minimum, 50 grams, 10 years. Quantities increased, sentences increased, and if you were cooking meth, the penalties multiplied based on the amount of precursor chemicals found, even if you hadn't actually produced that much finished product. These laws were passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Politicians competed to be tough on crime. Nobody wanted to be accused of being soft on drugs. The result was an explosion in incarceration. The US prison population, which had been relatively stable for decades, skyrocketed. By the early 2000s, America had the highest incarceration rate in the world, more people in prison per capita than any nation in history, including authoritarian regimes. Meth users and low-level dealers filled prisons. Many were non-violent offenders, people with addiction problems, not hardened criminals. First-time offenders received the same mandatory minimums as repeat offenders. Mothers were separated from children. Fathers disappeared behind bars, and when they were released, often after serving years or decades, they emerged with criminal records that made employment nearly impossible, no treatment for their addiction, and straight back into the communities where they'd used. The recidivism rate was predictably high. Studies show that incarceration without treatment doesn't reduce addiction, it just interrupts it. People get clean in prison because drugs aren't available, though even that isn't entirely true. Drugs do get into prisons, but their underlying addiction isn't addressed. No therapy, no counselling, no addressing the trauma or mental illness that contributed to their drug use, so when they're released they relapse, and because they're now on parole or probation, that relapse sends them back to prison. It's a revolving door that costs taxpayers billions and destroys lives without solving anything. The racial disparities are impossible to ignore. While meth use is predominantly among white Americans, particularly in rural areas, the criminal justice response was initially more lenient than it had been for crack cocaine, which devastated black urban communities. Crack offences carried penalties 100 times more severe than powder cocaine offences for equivalent amounts, a disparity widely recognised as racist. Meth offences, while harsh, weren't as disproportionately punished. This revealed the uncomfortable truth that drug policy in America has always been shaped by who's using the drugs as much as by the drugs themselves. By the 2010s, the failures of mass incarceration were undeniable. Prisons were overcrowded and expensive. Crime rates hadn't dropped proportionally, and addiction was worse than ever. Some jurisdictions began experimenting with alternatives. Drug courts offered treatment instead of incarceration for non-violent offenders. Participants were required to attend regular court hearings, submit to drug testing, complete treatment programs, and maintain employment or education. Success meant charges dismissed. Failure meant jail. Drug courts showed mixed results. For some people, the structure and accountability were life-changing. The threat of incarceration motivated them to stay clean long enough for treatment to work. For others, the system was too rigid, too punitive, too quick to send people to jail for relapses that are a normal part of recovery. California passed Proposition 36 in 2000, which diverted first- and second-time nonviolent drug offenders to treatment instead of prison. Other states passed similar laws. The results were generally positive: reduced incarceration, lower costs, similar or lower recidivism rates, but implementation was inconsistent and treatment resources were often inadequate. Oregon took the bolder step in 2020 by passing Measure 110, which decriminalized possession of all drugs, including meth. Instead of criminal penalties, people caught with drugs received a ticket and information about treatment resources. The goal was to treat addiction as a health issue, not a criminal one. Early results were controversial. Some pointed to increased public drug use, others to reduced arrests and increased treatment access. It's too soon to fully evaluate, but Oregon's experiment is being watched closely by other jurisdictions considering similar approaches. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001, and invested heavily in treatment and harm reduction. 20 years later, drug deaths and HIV infections had dropped dramatically. Portugal is often held up as proof that decriminalisation works. But critics note Portugal's robust social safety net, universal healthcare, housing support, employment programs, and argue those factors are as important as decriminalisation itself. The debate over sentencing reform continues. Advocates argue that punishment doesn't deter addiction, and that resources should be redirected from prisons to treatment. They point to data showing treatment is far more cost-effective than incarceration, and actually reduces drug use. Opponents argue that decriminalisation sends the wrong message, that consequences are necessary, and that public drug use creates unsafe communities. What's often missing from this debate is the voice of people directly affected. Users, families, and communities devastated by meth have complex views that don't fit neatly into tough-on crime or decriminalisation camps. Many want accountability and consequences for dealers who profit from addiction, but they also want treatment for users, compassion for people struggling, and systemic changes that address why people turn to drugs in the first place. The legal landscape is slowly shifting. Mandatory minimums are being rolled back in some jurisdictions. More prosecutors are declining to pursue charges for simple possession. Some states are expunging drug convictions, giving people a second chance at employment and housing. But progress is slow, inconsistent, and often reversed when political winds shift. What's clear is this: we've tried mass incarceration for 40 years, and it failed. Prisons are full, addiction is worse, and communities are devastated. The question isn't whether the current system works. It demonstrably doesn't. The question is whether we have the courage to try something different, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it challenges our assumptions about punishment and accountability. Because the cost of doing nothing, of maintaining the failed status quo, is measured in destroyed lives and lost generations. And that's a cost we can't afford to keep paying. Many meth users are self-medicating, untreated mental illness, depression, PTSD, bipolar disorder. Meth offers temporary relief, but it worsens symptoms long-term. Effective treatment requires addressing both addiction and mental health, a dual diagnosis approach that's complex, expensive, and desperately needed. The relationship between methamphetamine and mental illness is a tangled web of cause and effect that clinicians struggle to unravel. Does mental illness lead to meth use, or does meth use cause mental illness? The answer, frustratingly, is both. And understanding this bidirectional relationship is critical to effective treatment, because you can't successfully treat addiction without addressing mental health, and you can't successfully treat mental health while someone is actively using meth. Let's start with the self-medication hypothesis. Many people who become addicted to meth were struggling with untreated mental illness long before they ever touched the drug. Depression that makes getting out of bed feel impossible. Anxiety that turns every social interaction into a minefield. PTSD from childhood abuse, sexual assault, combat trauma, or domestic violence. Bipolar disorder with its exhausting cycles of mania and crushing depression. ADHD that makes focusing on anything feel like trying to hold water in your hands. These conditions are painful, isolating, and for many people, especially those without access to healthcare, untreated. Therapy costs money and requires transportation. Psychiatric medications require prescriptions, regular appointments, and often trial and error to find what works. In rural areas, mental health professionals are scarce or non-existent. Even in cities, waiting lists stretch for months, and their stigma, asking for help with mental health, is seen as weakness, as failure, as something to be ashamed of. Into this suffering, meth arrives like a miracle. For someone with depression, Meth provides energy, motivation, and euphoria. Everything depression steals. Suddenly you can get out of bed, clean the house, engage with life. For someone with social anxiety, meth provides confidence and sociability. You can talk to people, go to parties, feel normal. For someone with PTSD, meth offers escape from intrusive memories and emotional numbness. For someone with undiagnosed ADHD, meth provides the focus and calm that their brain has been seeking their whole life. The relief is real, at least initially. Meth does improve some symptoms of mental illness in the short term. That's why it's so seductive and why people believe they've finally found something that helps. The problem, of course, is that meth's benefits are temporary and illusory, while its harms are cumulative and devastating. Chronic meth use doesn't just fail to treat mental illness, it actively worsens it. The depression becomes deeper. The anxiety becomes paranoia. The trauma symptoms intensify, and meth creates its own psychiatric symptoms that can be difficult to distinguish from underlying mental illness. Meth-induced psychosis can look identical to schizophrenia. Auditory and visual hallucinations, paranoid delusions, disorganized thinking. Meth-induced mood swings can mimic bipolar disorder. The cognitive impairment from chronic use can look like ADHD or dementia. This creates diagnostic chaos. When someone presents for treatment, clinicians face a difficult question. Which symptoms are from the drug and which are from underlying mental illness? A person who's been using meth heavily might be paranoid and hallucinating. Is that meth-induced psychosis that will resolve with abstinence? Or is it schizophrenia that requires antipsychotic medication? You often can't know until the person has been clean for weeks or months, which is difficult to achieve without treatment, which requires an accurate diagnosis. It's a catch-22. The dual diagnosis, having both addiction and mental illness, is extremely common. Studies suggest that over half of people with substance use disorders also have a mental health disorder, and vice versa. For meth specifically, the rates are even higher. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, and bipolar disorder are all overrepresented among meth users compared to the general population. Treating dual diagnosis is exponentially more complicated than treating either condition alone. Traditional addiction treatment programs often aren't equipped to handle serious mental illness. They focus on sobriety, behavioral change, and peer support, which is valuable but insufficient for someone who's also battling severe depression or bipolar disorder. These programs might exclude people on psychiatric medications, viewing all drugs, even prescribed ones, as problematic. Or they might lack staff trained in mental health care. Conversely, mental health treatment programs often aren't equipped to handle active addiction. Psychiatrists prescribe medications assuming patients will take them consistently, not understanding that addiction disrupts everything, including medication compliance. Therapists use talk therapy approaches that require cognitive function and emotional regulation, both of which are impaired during active drug use. Many mental health facilities have policies against treating people who are actively using, viewing addiction as a separate problem that needs to be addressed first. This creates a terrible gap. People with dual diagnosis are often told by addiction programs, get your mental health treated first, and told by mental health programs, get clean first. They bounce between systems, falling through the cracks, getting neither the addiction treatment nor the mental health care they desperately need. And then they're blamed for not getting better, as if their failure is personal rather than systemic. Effective dual diagnosis treatment requires integrated care, programs that address both addiction and mental illness simultaneously. This means having staff trained in both areas, using evidence-based approaches for each condition, and understanding how they interact. It means prescribing psychiatric medications while also providing addiction counseling. It means recognizing that someone might need to stabilize their mental health before they can fully engage with addiction treatment or vice versa. These programs exist, but they're rare, expensive, and often inaccessible. Insurance coverage for integrated dual diagnosis treatment is inconsistent. Many programs are in urban areas, unreachable for rural populations, and even when programs are available, there are waiting lists, eligibility requirements, and costs that put them out of reach for the people who need them most. Medication-assisted treatment for co-occurring disorders is another area of challenge and opportunity. For opioid addiction, we have medications like methadone and buprenorphine that reduce cravings and allow people to stabilize their lives while addressing underlying issues. For meth addiction, we don't have equivalent medications yet, though research is ongoing. Several drugs are being studied: naltrexone, normally used for alcohol and opioid addiction, bupropion, an antidepressant that may reduce meth cravings, and modafinil, a wakefulness drug that might ease the exhaustion of early abstinence. Meanwhile, treating the underlying mental illness is critical. Antidepressants for depression, mood stabilizers for bipolar disorder, antipsychotics for schizophrenia or severe psychosis, anti-anxiety medications used carefully and non-addictively. These can all be part of effective treatment. But prescribing is complicated during early recovery, when the brain is still healing from meth damage and symptoms are fluctuating. Trauma-informed care is especially important. Many people with addiction have experienced significant trauma, and traditional confrontational addiction treatment approaches can be re-traumatizing. Trauma-informed care recognizes the impact of trauma, creates physically and emotionally safe environments, and uses therapeutic approaches specifically designed for trauma survivors like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or trauma-focused CBT. The peer support movement has been powerful for dual diagnosis. People with lived experience of both mental illness and addiction provide support, understanding, and hope that professionals, no matter how skilled, sometimes can't. Seeing someone who's been where you are and come out the other side is profoundly powerful. Peer support specialists work in treatment programs, serve as mentors, and lead support groups. Their presence says, "You're not broken, you're not hopeless, recovery is possible." Family involvement is another critical component. Families affected by dual diagnosis face unique challenges. They're dealing with both the chaos of addiction and the challenges of mental illness, mood swings, hospitalizations, medication management, crisis interventions, family therapy, education programs, and support groups like NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, help families understand both conditions and learn how to support their loved ones without enabling them. The bottom line is this: you cannot successfully treat meth addiction without addressing mental health, and you cannot successfully treat mental health while ignoring active addiction. The two are intertwined, each exacerbating the other, creating a vicious cycle that's nearly impossible to escape without comprehensive, integrated treatment. The fact that such treatment is scarce and inaccessible is a policy failure, a moral failure, and a public health catastrophe. We know what works, we just lack the will and resources to provide it to everyone who needs it, and so people suffer, trapped between two conditions, unable to get help for either, blamed for their own suffering. It's a system designed to fail the most vulnerable, and until we fix it, the dual diagnosis crisis will continue to destroy lives that could have been saved. Chemists are always innovating. New synthetic stimulants emerge regularly, designed to skirt laws and mimic meth's effects. As governments crack down on one substance, another appears. The cat-and-mouse game continues, with public health always one step behind. The history of drug policy is essentially a history of unintended consequences and chemical whack-a-mole. Ban one substance, and chemists, both legitimate researchers and underground manufacturers, will synthesize something similar but technically legal. regulate the precursors needed to make a drug, and manufacturers will find alternative synthesis routes. Crack down in one country, and production shifts to another. The drug trade is adaptive, innovative, and always evolving, and the future of methamphetamine is likely to follow this same frustrating pattern. We're already seeing the evolution in real time. When pseudo-ephedrine became difficult to obtain, meth manufacturers shifted to P2P synthesis methods that didn't require it. When law enforcement learned to detect certain chemical signatures, manufacturers altered their processes. The drug itself evolved, from powder to crystal, from lower purity to consistently high purity, from a regional problem to a global commodity. But meth isn't the end of the line, it's just the current iteration. And there are several emerging trends that suggest where stimulant abuse might be heading in the coming years and decades. First, there's the rise of novel synthetic stimulants, often called designer drugs or research chemicals. These are substances engineered to mimic the effects of established drugs like meth or MDMA, while having slightly different chemical structures. Because drug laws typically ban specific chemical compounds rather than entire classes of effects, a clever chemist can create something that produces meth-like effects, but is technically legal, at least until lawmakers catch up and ban that specific compound. Examples include compounds like ephedrine, methylone, and alpha-PVP, commonly known as flakka. These synthetic cathinones were sold legally for years as bath salts or research chemicals, marketed with disclaimers like, "not for human consumption" to skirt regulations. They produce stimulant effects, energy, euphoria, increased focus, but also cause severe side effects, extreme paranoia, violent behavior, hypothermia, and death. Once governments banned these specific compounds, manufacturers simply tweaked the molecular structure and released new variants. This game of chemical whack-a-mole is exhausting for regulators and dangerous for users. Each new compound is an experiment with unpredictable effects and unknown long-term consequences. Users become unwitting guinea pigs. And by the time public health officials understand the risks of one compound and get it banned, several more have already hit the market. China has been a major source of these novel synthetic drugs. Chinese chemical manufacturers produce them legally in China and ship them globally, often mislabeled as industrial chemicals or hidden in legitimate cargo. The US and other countries have pressured China to regulate these substances with limited success. When one Chinese company is shut down, others emerge. When one chemical is banned, manufacturers shift to producing similar but technically different compounds. Another emerging threat is the potential for more sophisticated drug manufacturing using advances in chemistry and biotechnology. Imagine if meth production could be moved from chemical labs to bioreactors, using genetically modified bacteria or yeast to produce precursor chemicals, or even the drug itself. This is speculative but not impossible. Biomanufacturing is already used to produce pharmaceuticals, insulin, and even opioids. If similar techniques could be applied to illicit drugs, it would revolutionize production, making it cheaper, more scalable, and harder to detect and interdict. There's also the potential for even more potent stimulants. Methamphetamine is already incredibly powerful, but what if chemists develop something stronger? What if they create a stimulant with meth's euphoria and focus but fewer side effects or less addiction potential? It sounds like science fiction, but pharmaceutical companies have been searching for exactly that, a stimulant that's medically useful without the abuse potential. If they succeed, that knowledge will inevitably leak into the illicit market. The darknet markets have changed how drugs are bought and sold. Online marketplaces accessible through encrypted browsers and cryptocurrencies connect buyers directly with sellers anywhere in the world. You can order meth, synthetic stimulants, or anything else from the comfort of your home, delivered by mail. Law enforcement has shut down major darknet markets, Silk Road, Alpha Bay, Hansa, but new ones always emerge. This distribution model makes drugs more accessible, especially in areas where local dealers are scarce. There's also increasing concern about contamination. Just as fentanyl has been mixed into heroin, cocaine, and even fake prescription pills, there's potential for meth to be contaminated with other substances. This could be accidental, cross-contamination during production, or intentional if dealers want to cut costs or create a different effect. Fentanyl-laced meth has already been found, creating a deadly combination of stimulant and depressant that confuses users and first responders. Pharmaceutical companies continue researching stimulants for legitimate medical uses, ADHD, narcolepsy, cognitive enhancement. Some of these drugs inevitably get diverted to illicit use. Adderall, a prescription amphetamine, is already widely abused by students and professionals seeking cognitive enhancement. As new, more effective stimulants are developed, they'll face the same risk of diversion and abuse. There's also the looming possibility of genetic or neurological interventions. What if, instead of taking a drug, people could use gene therapy or brain stimulation to achieve similar effects? Technologies like transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and deep brain stimulation are being researched for treating depression and other conditions. If these technologies could reliably produce euphoria or cognitive enhancement, would they become the drugs of the future? And how would society regulate them? The other future concern is climate change and geopolitical instability. As regions become less habitable due to drought, flooding, or conflict, migration increases, borders become more porous, and state capacity to regulate drug production and trafficking declines. Failed states and ungoverned territories become havens for drug manufacturing. Climate-driven poverty increases demand for cheap drugs as people seek escape from deteriorating conditions. From a public health perspective, the future looks challenging. Each new drug requires research to understand its effects, risks, and treatment approaches. But research takes years, and drugs evolve faster than science can keep up. We're always responding to yesterday's crisis while today's is already emerging. The policy question is whether prohibition itself is sustainable. For a century, the global drug control regime has been based on banning substances and using law enforcement to suppress supply. It hasn't worked. Drugs are more available, more potent, and cheaper than ever. Overdose deaths are at record highs. Cartels are more powerful than ever. Maybe the future requires fundamentally rethinking drug policy, moving away from prohibition toward regulation, harm reduction, and treatment. Some advocates argue for legalization and regulation of all drugs, including stimulants like meth. The argument is that legal regulated drugs would be safer, no contamination, known purity and dose, would eliminate the black market and associated violence, and would allow honest public health messaging about risks. Tax revenue could fund treatment and education. It's a radical idea that many find unthinkable, but as the body count from prohibition continues rising, it's being discussed more seriously. The future of meth and synthetic stimulants isn't just a pharmacological question. It's a social, political, and ethical question about how we respond to the human desire to alter consciousness, to escape suffering, to enhance performance. It's about whether we treat drug use as a crime or a health issue, whether we prioritize punishment or treatment, whether we learn from the failures of the past or repeat them with new substances. What's certain is this: the drug trade will continue evolving. Chemists will keep synthesizing new compounds, manufacturers will keep finding new production methods, distributors will keep exploiting new technologies and routes, and people will keep using drugs, whether out of desperation, curiosity, or the simple human drive to feel different than they do. The question isn't whether there will be a next meth. The question is whether we'll be ready for it when it arrives, whether we'll have learned anything from the current crisis, or whether we'll just watch history repeat itself with different molecules. Right now, the smart money isn't on learning, but hope, however irrational, persists. Because what's the alternative? Across America, communities are fighting back. Local coalitions, peer support groups, and harm reduction organizations are filling gaps left by government inaction. They're saving lives, one person, one naloxone kit, one conversation at a time. These aren't headlines, they're quiet revolutions. When the government fails, when politicians offer only rhetoric, when law enforcement focuses on arrests rather than help, communities don't have the luxury of waiting for someone else to solve the problem. They organize, they mobilize, they do what they can with whatever resources they have. And across America, in towns devastated by meth, people are fighting back in ways that rarely make national news, but that save lives every single day. Let's start with the mothers. In small towns across the Midwest and South, mothers whose children became addicted or died from meth have formed coalitions. They meet in church basements, community centers, or someone's living room. They share stories, cry together, and then get to work. They organize awareness campaigns, speak at schools, lobby local government for treatment resources, and provide support to families going through what they've already survived. These aren't professional activists or public health experts. They're grieving mothers who transform their pain into purpose. Organizations like Moms Off Meth and local chapters of parents of addicted loved ones provide emotional support and practical resources. They help families navigate treatment options, understand addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing, and cope with the trauma of watching a loved one struggle. They challenge stigma by putting human faces on addiction. These are our children, our siblings, our neighbors. They're not statistics or cautionary tales. They're people who deserve compassion and help. In some communities, local coalitions have formed to address meth more comprehensively. These bring together law enforcement, healthcare providers, schools, faith communities, and residents. The goal is a coordinated response: prevention education in schools, treatment resources for people who want help, harm reduction for people who aren't ready to quit, and law enforcement focused on major dealers rather than users. The Montana Meth Project was one of the more famous examples. Launched in 2005, it used graphic advertising to deter meth use, showing the horrifying physical and social consequences. Billboards, TV spots, and print ads featured the tagline "Not even once," depicting users losing teeth, picking at their skin, and destroying their lives. The campaign was controversial. Some praised its bluntness, others criticized it for potentially glamorizing the drug or creating fatalism. If one use destroys you, why bother trying to quit? Studies on its effectiveness were mixed, but it sparked conversations and brought attention to the crisis. Peer support programs have been particularly powerful. These are led by people in recovery who understand addiction intimately. They provide mentorship, hope, and practical guidance based on lived experience. Crystal Meth Anonymous, modelled on 12-step programs, offers free meetings in many communities. Participants share their stories, support each other through cravings and challenges, and build sober social networks to replace using communities. Some communities have established sober living homes, residences where people in recovery can live in a structured, drug-free environment with peers. These homes provide stability, accountability, and community during the vulnerable early months of recovery. Residents often share responsibilities, attend meetings together, and support each other through the daily challenges of sobriety. Quality varies widely. Some are well managed with rules and support. Others are exploitative operations that charge high rents while providing minimal services. But at their best, sober living homes bridge the gap between treatment programs and independent living. Harm reduction efforts, while controversial, are saving lives at the community level. Needle exchange programs, where they're legal, prevent the spread of HIV, hepatitis C, and other bloodborne infections. Users can exchange used syringes for clean ones, no questions asked. These programs also provide access to other services, HIV and hepatitis testing, wound care, naloxone kits, and connections to treatment when people are ready. Some communities have gone further, establishing safe consumption sites, supervised spaces where people can use drugs with medical staff present to intervene in case of overdose or complications. These exist in Canada, Europe, and a few US cities, always amid controversy. Opponents argue they enable drug use and send the wrong message. Proponents point to data showing they reduce overdose deaths, connect people to treatment, and decrease public drug use and syringe litter. The US has been slow to embrace this model, but community pressure in cities like Philadelphia and San Francisco has pushed for pilot programs. Faith communities play a complicated but important role. Some churches provide space for 12-step meetings, support groups, and sober activities. They offer non-judgmental support, practical help with food or housing, and spiritual community. Other churches unfortunately perpetuate stigma by framing addiction as sin or spiritual weakness, making people feel ashamed rather than supported. The most helpful faith communities recognize addiction as a medical condition while offering spiritual support as one component of recovery. Schools have become frontline prevention sites. Some communities have implemented evidence-based prevention programs that go beyond just say no messaging. These programs focus on building life skills, stress management, decision-making, social connections that make young people less vulnerable to drug use. They provide accurate information about drugs without exaggeration, recognizing that kids are skeptical of scare tactics. And they address underlying risk factors like trauma, mental illness, and lack of opportunity. Community resource centers in some towns provide wraparound services, addiction counseling, mental health care, employment assistance, housing support, legal aid, all under one roof. This recognizes that addiction doesn't exist in isolation. People struggling with meth often face multiple challenges simultaneously: unemployment, homelessness, criminal records, untreated mental illness. Addressing one without addressing others is ineffective. Integrated services make it easier for people to get comprehensive help. Some communities have established drug take-back programs and prescription monitoring to prevent prescription drug abuse from becoming a gateway to meth. While the relationship between prescription stimulants like Adderall and meth use is complex, preventing diversion and abuse of prescribed medications is part of a broader prevention strategy. Art and storytelling have become tools for healing and advocacy. Community members create art installations featuring photos of people lost to addiction, poems written by people in recovery, or paintings depicting the journey from addiction to healing. These humanize the crisis, challenge stigma, and create spaces for grief and hope. Theatre groups perform plays about addiction, inviting community dialogue. Documentary filmmakers tell local stories, preserving memory and educating others. Youth leadership programs recognize that young people aren't just potential victims, they're also potential agents of change. Some communities involve youth in peer education, where teenagers teach younger kids about drug risks using language and approaches that resonate more than adult messaging. Youth-led advocacy groups push for policy changes, more treatment resources, and better mental health services in schools. Local newspapers and media, particularly in smaller towns, play an important role by covering the crisis honestly and humanely. Instead of just reporting arrests and overdoses, some journalists tell stories of recovery, profile community responses, and investigate systemic issues like lack of treatment access. This keeps the crisis visible and holds officials accountable. Economic development initiatives recognize that preventing meth use requires addressing underlying poverty and hopelessness. Some communities have created job training programs, small business support, and economic revitalization efforts aimed specifically at providing alternatives to the drug trade and giving people reason to hope for the future. Recovery cafes and community centers provide substance-free social spaces. These are places where people in recovery or those avoiding drug scenes can socialize, attend events, and build community without alcohol or drugs. They combat the isolation that both precedes and follows addiction, creating belonging and connection. The common thread through all these grassroots efforts is that they're driven by people who've been personally affected, family members, people in recovery, community members who've watched their towns struggle. They're not waiting for government solutions or national initiatives. They're doing what they can with what they have where they are. It's not glamorous. It rarely makes headlines. There are no big budgets or celebrity spokespeople, just ordinary people showing up day after day, meeting after meeting, conversation after conversation, slowly building networks of care and support that catch people who fall and help them climb back up. These grassroots efforts won't solve the meth crisis alone. They can't fix poverty, rebuild economies, or create universal healthcare, but they save lives. They provide hope. They prove that community matters, that people care, that nobody has to fight addiction alone. And sometimes that's enough to make the difference between life and death, between giving up and trying one more time. The revolution won't be televised because it's happening too quietly, too locally, too humbly, but it's happening, and it's the best chance many people have. Behind every statistic is a human being. Survivors of meth addiction speak of hitting rock bottom, of losing everything, and of finding a way back. Their stories aren't neat or easy, but they're real, and they remind us that recovery is possible, even when it seems impossible. Let's call her Sarah, though that's not her real name. She's 38 now, 5 years sober, working as a medical assistant and raising 2 daughters. But 10 years ago, she was living in her car, alienated from her family, and smoking meth daily just to function. She'd started using at 25 after a painful divorce and custody loss left her drowning in depression. A co-worker offered her meth at a party, promising it would make her feel better. It did for a while, then it consumed her. Sarah's bottom came in a hospital. She'd been awake for 6 days straight, convinced people were following her, and had gotten into a physical altercation with a stranger she believed was plotting against her. Police brought her to the emergency room instead of jail. A compassionate social worker sat with her for hours, waiting for the psychosis to clear, and then asked a simple question: "Do you want help?" Sarah had been asked that before. Family members had begged her to get help. Judges had ordered her to get help, but this time, for reasons she still can't fully articulate, she said yes. Not because she believed recovery was possible, she didn't, but because she was so tired, so exhausted by the constant chaos, that even the slim possibility of something different seemed worth trying. She went to a residential treatment program, 90 days away from everything and everyone she knew. The first month was hell, crushing depression, insomnia, memories of all the things she'd done while using flooding back without the drug to numb them. She almost left a dozen times, but something kept her there. Maybe stubbornness, maybe the counsellor who seemed to actually believe she could recover, maybe just the structure and routine after years of chaos. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. She started sleeping again. Food began to taste like something other than cardboard. She laughed at something someone said in group therapy, genuinely laughed, and realised it was the first time she'd felt joy in years. After 90, Days, she transitioned to a sober living home, then to outpatient therapy, then to independent living with intensive support. It wasn't linear. She relapsed twice in the first year, both times triggered by stress and isolation. But instead of spiraling completely, she reached out for help, got back into treatment, and tried again. With each attempt, she learned more about her triggers, her patterns, her underlying trauma and depression that had made meth so appealing in the first place. 5 years later, Sarah has rebuilt a relationship with her daughters, who are now teenagers. She works in healthcare, inspired by the people who helped her when she was at her lowest. She sponsors other women in recovery, sharing her story and providing the hope she once needed. Her life isn't perfect. She still struggles with depression, still goes to therapy, still has days where the cravings whisper seductively. But she has tools now, support, purpose, and she's alive, which at one point seemed unlikely. Or consider Marcus, 42, a former construction worker who used meth to keep up with brutal work schedules and physical demands. He started using in his late 20s, casually at first, then daily. By 35, he had lost his job, his marriage, and custody of his son. He spent 3 years homeless, moving between shelters, abandoned buildings, and camping in the woods. Marcus's turning point came in a jail cell. Arrested for trespassing and possession, he faced his third strike and a potential 10-year sentence. A public defender connected him with a drug court program, treatment instead of prison, but with strict accountability. Marcus was skeptical, convinced he'd fail, but the alternative was a decade behind bars. Drug court was rigid and demanding. Weekly court appearances, frequent drug testing, mandatory counselling, and employment requirements. Any relapse meant immediate consequences. For Marcus, the structure was paradoxically freeing. Decisions were made for him. He just had to show up and comply. Slowly, he began to believe he might actually make it. He got a job washing dishes, then graduated to line cook. He moved into a sober living house, shared a room with 3 other men, and learned to live in community again. After a year, he completed the drug court program. After 2 years, he regained partial custody of his son. After 4 years, he became a journeyman electrician, earning more than he had in construction. Now, at 8 years sober, he owns a small electrical contracting business and employs 2 other men in recovery. Marcus is clear-eyed about his journey. Recovery isn't a destination, it's a daily practice. He goes to meetings, stays connected to his sponsor, and avoids situations where drugs are present. He talks openly with his son about his addiction, refusing to hide the past, but also refusing to let it define the future. He's building something, not just a business, but a life that feels worth living. Or take Jennifer, 51, who became addicted to meth in her 40s after it was introduced at a party. A successful real estate agent, she thought she could control it, that she was too smart, too stable, too privileged to become addicted. She was wrong. Within a year, she'd lost her license, her home, and most of her savings. Jennifer's recovery journey included multiple treatment attempts. The first program didn't work. She relapsed within a week of leaving. The second was better, but she still struggled with the underlying anxiety and perfectionism that had made meth's false confidence so appealing. The third time, she found a program that addressed her co-occurring anxiety disorder alongside the addiction. With the right medication, therapy, and support, something finally clicked. 10 years later, Jennifer works as a peer recovery specialist, helping other professionals navigate addiction and recovery. She speaks at conferences, writes about her experiences, and advocates for better mental health integration in addiction treatment. She's remarried, financially stable, and living a life that looks nothing like the chaos of her using days. But she's humble about it. knowing that recovery requires ongoing work and that complacency is dangerous. These stories share common threads. None of these people quit on their first try. All experience multiple relapses before achieving sustained sobriety. All needed external support, treatment programs, therapy, peer support, family, community resources. All addressed underlying issues, trauma, mental illness, poverty, that had made them vulnerable to addiction in the first place, and all found purpose in recovery, something that made sobriety worth fighting for. Children, careers, helping others, personal growth. But recovery stories can also perpetuate harmful myths if we're not careful. Not everyone who gets help succeeds. Many people die before finding recovery. Others achieve sobriety only to lose it again. Some struggle for decades, cycling through treatment and relapse, never quite finding stable footing. Recovery isn't about willpower or wanting it badly enough. It's about access to resources, supportive environments, biological factors, trauma histories, and honestly, sometimes luck. Survivors emphasize that recovery looks different for everyone. For some, it's complete abstinence and 12-step programs. For others, it's medication-assisted treatment and harm reduction. Some find spirituality helpful, others don't. Some rebuild relationships with family. Others create chosen families among other people in recovery. There's no single path, no correct way to recover. What survivors want people to understand is that addiction isn't a moral failing. They're not weak or bad people. They're people who experienced profound suffering, whether from trauma, mental illness, poverty, or existential despair, and found a substance that temporarily relieved that suffering. The substance turned on them as addictive substances do, but the underlying pain was real and valid. They also want people to know that recovery is possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, not quick, but possible. With the right support, resources and timing, people can and do rebuild their lives after meth addiction. They go back to school, repair relationships, find meaningful work, rediscover joy. They become parents, partners, friends again. They contribute to their communities, help others, and live full, complex, beautiful lives. The stories of survivors aren't just feel-good narratives or inspiration porn. They're evidence that treatment works when people can access it. Evidence that support matters. Evidence that even the most damaged brain can heal given time and the right conditions. Evidence that people are more than the worst thing they've ever done or the darkest period they've lived through. Every person who recovers from meth addiction is a small miracle, a rebellion against a system designed to discard them, a testament to human resilience. Their stories won't fix the crisis. We need policy changes, treatment funding, economic investment, and systemic reform for that. But their stories provide something equally important: hope. The stubborn, irrational, absolutely essential hope that things can be different, that lives can be rebuilt, that the person currently suffering an active addiction might someday be telling their own recovery story. And sometimes, hope is enough to keep someone alive long enough to get help. Sometimes it's the difference between giving up and trying one more day, and that matters more than any statistic ever could. So here we are, at the end of a journey that spans 5,000 years, from a scraggly plant clinging to rocky Chinese mountainsides, to the chemical devastation unfolding in trailer parks, super labs, and communities across the globe. From ancient healers brewing bitter tea to cartels manufacturing crystal meth by the ton, from medicine to weapon, from hope to horror. Tonight you've travelled through time and chemistry, through wars and policies, through human desperation and corporate greed. You've seen how a plant used carefully for millennia became a molecule synthesized carelessly for profit. You've watched as ephedrine became amphetamine, as amphetamine became methamphetamine, as medicine became plague, and you've witnessed the human cost, the lost teeth and picked skin, the shattered families and hollowed communities, the millions of lives touched by a drug that promised everything and took more. But here's what I hope you take away from this story. The plant didn't betray us. Chemistry didn't betray us. We betrayed each other. Ephedra grew in the mountains, neutral and patient, waiting to be used or ignored. It had no agenda, no morality, no intention. It was a tool, like fire or steel or language, capable of healing or harming depending on the hands that held it. For thousands of years, those hands held it with respect, with caution, with the wisdom of tradition. And then we stripped away that wisdom, that context, that care. We isolated the active compound, multiplied its potency, and mass-produced it without asking whether we should. We chased profit over health, convenience over safety, chemical solutions over human connection. And when things went wrong, when soldiers came home addicted, when housewives couldn't stop taking diet pills, when rural towns collapsed under the weight of meth, we blamed the users. We called them weak, immoral, criminal. We locked them up, wrote them off, turned away from their suffering. We treated addiction as a personal failing rather than a societal one, as if people chose desperation, chose poverty, chose trauma. But nobody chooses meth because their life is going well. They choose it because they're drowning and it offers air, even if that air is poisoned. They choose it because they need energy to work 3 jobs, because they need confidence to face another day, because they need escape from unbearable pain, because they need to feel something other than the crushing weight of hopelessness. Meth gives them that, briefly, powerfully, destructively. And by the time they realize the cost, they're already trapped. The real tragedy isn't that ephedra became methamphetamine. The real tragedy is that we built a world where so many people need methamphetamine, or something like it, just to survive. A world where wages are stagnant but rent keeps rising. Where healthcare is a luxury and mental health care barely exists. Where entire communities have been abandoned by industry, by government, by the promise of the American dream. Where trauma goes untreated, where poverty is criminalized, where asking for help is seen as weakness. Meth didn't create these conditions. It just made them visible. It carved them into bodies that couldn't be ignored, turned invisible suffering into undeniable physical reality. Every missing tooth, every scarred face, every life lost is a testament not to the power of a drug, but to the depth of human suffering that made the drug appealing in the first place. And yet, and this is important, people survive, they recover, they rebuild. Not because they're heroes or because they found some secret strength the rest of us lack, but because they got help. Because someone believed in them when they'd stopped believing in themselves. Because treatment was available, or a family member refused to give up, or a peer support group offered community, or pure stubborn chance kept them alive long enough for something to click. Recovery is possible. It's hard, messy, non-linear, and different for everyone. But it's possible. Thousands of people walk away from meth addiction every year and build lives worth living. They become parents again, workers again, whole people again. Not because the drug released them, but because we, as families, communities, societies, chose to help rather than punish, to treat rather than discard, to see them as human beings worthy of compassion, rather than problems to be solved through incarceration. The story of ephedra and methamphetamine is ultimately a story about choices. The choices of chemists who isolated compounds. The choices of companies that sold them. The choices of governments that regulated or failed to regulate. The choices of societies that prioritize some lives over others, some communities over others, profit over people, punishment over treatment. But it's also about the choices still ahead of us. We can keep doing what we've been doing. criminalizing users, militarizing borders, declaring war on substances that don't care about wars. Or we can try something different. We can invest in treatment that's actually accessible. We can address poverty and trauma and mental illness as seriously as we address crime. We can build communities where people have reasons to hope, where the future offers something better than the present. We can recognize that addiction isn't a moral failing but a medical condition and respond accordingly. The plant will keep growing in the mountains, chemists will keep synthesizing compounds, people will keep seeking relief from suffering. Those things are constants, unchangeable. What we can change is how we respond, whether we meet suffering with compassion or judgment, whether we build systems that heal or systems that harm, whether we see drug users as people who need help or problems that need eliminating. Ephedra's journey from medicine to plague took 5,000 years, but transformation can happen faster than that. Change happens when enough people decide that the old ways aren't working, that we can do better, that human lives are worth more than political talking points or quarterly profits. Change happens when we stop asking, why can't they just quit? And start asking, what pain are they trying to escape? And how can we help? So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in a world where methamphetamine still exists, where people are still suffering, where the legacy of an ancient plant continues unfolding in ways its first users could never have imagined, carry this with you. The crisis isn't inevitable. The deaths aren't acceptable. The suffering isn't necessary. We created this. And if we created it, we can change it. Not with easy answers or simple solutions, but with sustained commitment to addressing root causes, with compassion for people who are struggling, with treatment instead of prison, with prevention instead of punishment, with community instead of isolation, with hope instead of despair. The plant that became a pill, that became a plague, was neutral. It was waiting to be used wisely or foolishly. We chose foolishly, repeatedly, for decades, but we can choose differently going forward, not because it's easy or profitable or politically convenient, but because lives depend on it. Because behind every statistic is a human being who deserves better than what we've offered so far. Ephedra isn't the villain of this story. We are. And that's actually good news because it means we have the power to write a different ending. We just have to choose it. One policy change, one treatment centre, one compassionate conversation, one person helped at a time. The journey from plant to plague took millennia. The journey from plague to healing could take just one generation if we commit to it. If we decide that human life matters more than being tough on crime, that health matters more than punishment, that people struggling with addiction deserve help, not jail. Sleep well tonight, knowing that somewhere, someone is getting clean. Somewhere, a family is being reunited. Somewhere, a community is healing. It's not enough, not nearly enough, but it's proof that change is possible, that recovery exists, that the story isn't over, and tomorrow, when you wake up, remember, the ancient healers who first brewed ephedra tea did so to ease suffering. That was the point. That was always the point. Somewhere along the way we forgot. But we can remember. We can return to that original purpose, to heal, to help, to ease suffering rather than compound it. The plant is still growing in the mountains, the chemistry is still being written, the story is still unfolding, and the ending? That's up to us. Rest now. Dream of a world where medicine stays medicine, where suffering is met with compassion, where people get help instead of handcuffs, where ancient wisdom isn't lost to modern greed. It's not the world we have, but it could be the world we build, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one day at a time. Good night.